This video is the second of 3 YouTube videos concerning Australia's war with Japan. The video series focuses on the period between December 1941 and August 1942. Previous video, The Puzzle of 1942, outlined a paradox. Prior to World War I, Australia made a major effort to prepare for an attack from Japan. In 1911 a form of conscription was introduced, and a navy was established. The attack didn't come. Conversely, as World War II approached, a heavily armed and belligerent Japan presented a clear threat. Yet Australia deferred serious preparations to counter it. Australia's population had increased by 2 million since World War I, yet the permanent force army was smaller in 1938 than it was in 1914. And in 1941 the attack came. The attack that came, and the severity of losses, were breathtaking. Military failure in the 9 months between December 1941 and August 1942 caused almost 40% of Australia's war deaths, 30% of merchant shipping losses, close to a quarter of all naval losses to enemy action, and, perhaps, 40% of aircraft losses to combat. By the end of the war with Japan, almost 17,000 Australians had died from combat, or as prisoners of war, making up 60% of all Australian deaths in World War II. In relative terms, Australia's losses in the 9 months were equivalent to the United States losing more than 200,000 troops and 160 naval vessels. That Australia was unprepared for war is clear. One of the reasons for this unpreparedness seems to have been a sense of helplessness. A small nation claiming a massive territory cannot hope to defend it. A sentiment that did not appear to exist in 1911, but emerged sometime after this date and persisted well after the tragedies of 1942. In 1955 the Minister for Defence and South Australian politician, Sir Philip McBride, stated in the House of Representatives that the Australian people will not forget the experience that they had in the last war. That experience proved to them that Australia cannot defend itself unaided. This echoed comments made in Parliament in 1935 where the member for Ballarat, Archibald Fisking, claimed that we cannot defend ourselves, however much we may desire to do so, unless we remain in the Empire, thus strengthening the Empire and the League of Nations. But how true are these claims made both before and after the calamitous events of 1942? Armed with 20/20 hindsight, is it possible to construct the military defence of Australia within the resource and industrial constraints that existed before the war? Could Australia have had the wherewithal to have defended itself? To solve this puzzle, 3 questions need to be answered. Firstly, what was the threat that Australia had to be able to meet and defeat? Secondly, what mix of forces would Australia need to field to have altered the losses and setbacks in 1942? Thirdly, what would be required to create these forces, and could Australia have afforded to do this? The Japanese armed forces in 1941 consisted of 51 army divisions, or some 700,000 combat troops. It also included army and navy, aviation with more than 3,000 first-line aircraft. The Japanese Navy had a fleet of over 390 ships, that included 10 aircraft carriers. Japanese forces also had levels of training, and in many cases battle experience, that Australian forces in 1941 lacked. Japanese army conscripts had 2 years of service, with the first year largely spent in training. By comparison, Australian militia did 3 months of training before passing into reserve. The Australian Imperial Force troops for service overseas had anywhere from 6 to 18 months before they were committed to action. Japanese pilot training could be anywhere from 17 to 42 months. Many pilots had 500 to 800 hours of flying time. Australian pilot training early in the war was less than 10 months and flying experience more like 150 hours. Japanese Navy training was also to a high standard, although Australian Navy regular sailors were probably comparably trained. In terms of military technology and industry, the standout threat was Japanese aviation. Australia lacked the industry and technology to produce effective combat aircraft in 1941. It also found it difficult to buy aircraft once war started, as the demand for aircraft by the major powers took priority. The practical Japanese threat. Japan could not devote all its forces to conflict in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It was recognized by Australian commentators even in the 1930s. Of the 51 divisions in the army, only 11 were earmarked for initial operations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. By the time Japanese forces approached Australian territory, the lead combat forces were brigade size, between 3,000 and 5,000 troops. Although the Japanese had over 3,000 combat aircraft, it could only mount raids with carrier-based aircraft totaling 100 to 200 aircraft. These aircraft carriers could not stay for prolonged periods on one operation. They were also vulnerable to land-based aircraft. A Japanese landing had to be successful quickly to establish airfields for ground-based aircraft, or the Japanese risked losing valuable Navy vessels, including aircraft carriers. If we limit our analysis to the types of threats that could indeed emerge around Australia in 1941 to 1942, we can define defence priorities against a concrete threat. Under this scenario, being able to defend Australia would mean defence of Papua and Australian mandated territories in New Guinea, including the Admiralty Islands, defence of Australia, and defence of shipping, including coastal shipping, critical international trade and shipping needed to support troops and air bases in the mandated territories. The type of warfare that emerged in the Pacific and around Australia was dubbed triamphibious warfare by Winston Churchill. Perhaps more accurately it could be termed archipelagic warfare. The war with Japan involved seizing, or retaking, strategic points from which control over adjacent areas of land and sea could be exercised. This usually took the form of islands, but on larger islands such as New Guinea it involved holding selected points rather than the whole landmass. As a generalization, control was exercised by providing ground forces to hold the territory, air forces to control the surrounding sea, and naval forces to maintain the air and ground forces in place. Wherever possible, these strategic points needed to be mutually supporting and provide overlapping air cover. An attacking Japanese naval force would need to survive air attack and then land sufficient troops to overwhelm the defending ground troops quickly. A stalemate on the ground would theoretically favor the side that had better logistics, that is, the side that was able to use naval forces by night under cover of air forces by day, to reinforce and resupply. For continental Australia, the types of forces needed to counter the most likely Japanese moves were Darwin and the Northern Territory, 1 trained and fully equipped division, and up to 8 Air Force squadrons. Another 100 combat aircraft. Perth and Fremantle, 1 trained and equipped motorized division and another 8 aircraft squadrons. Tasmania, South Australia and Victoria, 1 brigade and 2 squadrons of aircraft each, with 2 additional aircraft squadrons kept in reserve. Australian East Coast, 3 trained and equipped motorized divisions and 24 squadrons of aircraft. This leaves the question of naval support to protect movement of shipping and to counter Japanese naval threats to the coast. An estimate of 90 warships, of which 60 to 70 would be corvettes, would probably suffice if operating within range of ground-based air cover for coastal and New Guinea operations. Based on this allocation, the total forces required to defend both Australia and territories in Papua and New Guinea would be an army of 8 divisions, an air force of 60 squadrons, or some 700 frontline aircraft, a navy in excess of 100 warships, of which more than half would be cheap and quick-to-build corvettes for escort and mine warfare. It should be noted that a force similar to this in size was created by Australia by 1944. The effect of this ground force allocation on Japanese forces would have been significant. Most key areas would be covered by at least a division of 3 brigades. A Japanese force wishing to attack and hold territory would need to mount 3 times this force. That is a force of 3 divisions, or 9 brigades, to be hopeful of success. The effect the 700-strong air force would be to place the Japanese in a major dilemma. Any attacking naval task force might be intercepted up to 1,000 kilometers out from an Australian shore, as much as 2 days steaming. This would be a major risk, especially when it is considered that many areas of air coverage overlap and can also be quickly reinforced. In comparison to the forces we have estimated as needed for the defence of Australia, the situation in early 1942 was quite dire. In theory, Australia had 5 divisions and 15 aircraft squadrons for its defence. But these were paper divisions and largely obsolete aircraft. In reality, In 1942, the Army had itself assessed that it had less than the equivalent of 4 trained brigades. Only one of these brigade equivalents was fully trained for mobile warfare. The Air Force was no better. Its 15 squadrons were mostly obsolete or were flying boats or inadequate rear-away trainers. In reality, there was only 56 contemporary combat aircraft available in Australia, the equivalent of 4 squadrons. In summary, Australia needed almost 6 times as many trained ground forces as it actually had in Australia in early 1942. It also needed 15 times the number of contemporary combat aircraft. Ironically, by 1944, Australia's armed forces were approaching the size suggested by our analysis. So, Australia could produce a defence force capable of thwarting the Japanese in 1942. The issue was not one of capability but timing, planning and budget. These are the topics we will examine next. How long does it take to create a warfighting organisation? Another way of considering this problem is to ask yourself, how long would it take to train some high school graduates that have never played sport to compete in the AFL or NRL match? You would first need to get their fitness up. How long would this take? Then you would need to teach them ball skills. Next there would be team training. And more team training and team tactics. Then there would be practice matches. Finally, at some point you would be ready to compete. Maybe. As we will see, it takes time to create successful warfighting organizations, whether they are a ship, Air Force squadron, Army division. In 1936, the wonderfully named Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate noted in an article that many people held the view that the Australians were natural soldiers, and that an army could be created overnight. The same article also noted that war today was a highly scientific business, and it took a lot of training to make an efficient soldier. Just how much training was required was underestimated. By the end of the war it took 1.5 years to train a pilot. But at the start of the war, Australia thought it could create a pilot in roughly half this time at approximately 10 months. Japanese pilots had almost 6 months more training than the average Australian pilot. The key point is that before organizations can be created, individuals must be trained. So, indicative training times for soldiers, specialists, officers and pilots are: soldiers, 3 to 6 months. Technical specialists, such as radio operators or mechanics, 6 to 12 months. A generalist officer, such as an infantry officer or a watch officer on a ship, 6 to 12 months. And, as we have seen, pilots took approximately 18 months. Warfighting is heavily dependent upon leadership, and leaders are also not created overnight. In wartime conditions, natural leaders do emerge and can be promoted quickly. However, in preparing for war, creating leaders from ordinary mortals also takes time. A sergeant needs experience as a corporal. A corporal needs experience as a private. All of this means that middle-level leaders, such as sergeants or petty officers, lieutenant commanders or squadron leaders, also takes time. Somewhere between 2 and 3 years of training and hands-on experience. The time needed to create leaders directly affects how quickly new organizations can be created. So, now we can answer the question, how long does it take to create a new military organization? Imagine that the red circle represents an experienced ship's crew or army division. To create a new organization, we first need to take the experienced leaders and split them up to build new organizations. These new organizations, to be brought up to strength, take on newly trained privates and sailors and junior officers. New units are then established as represented by the beige-colored circle. But they are not experienced. The new organization must train together for 6 to 12 months before they are ready for war. Once fully trained as a team, the ship or division can be sent to war. Or, the process can be repeated to expand the warfighting organization even further. In this way, one infantry division could be used to create 4 infantry divisions, but this would take 3 years. So how long would it have taken Australia to create a defence force of 60 Air Force squadrons, over 100 ships and 8 divisions? Using our mobilisation model we can work backwards to determine when Australia should have started seriously training and expanding its defences. By 1941 Australia needed trained and experienced forces. This means that the creation of 100 ships, 60 aircraft squadrons, and 8 Army divisions needed to be in place by 1940. As we discussed previously, we need to allow 6 to 12 months for organizations to have worked up together to be effective in battle. So these organizations needed to at least be formed in 1940. We can then work backwards each year to see what size of force was needed. Using this model, in 1935 Australia could have started mobilization with as few as 4 ships, 2 aircraft squadrons and an infantry brigade. Realistically, even parsimonious Australian politicians did not allow the forces to drop to this low level in the 1930s. At least on paper. So, we will assume that from 1935 to 1937 the forces consisted of about 13 naval warships, 8 Air Force squadrons and 1 Army division. This analysis allows us to now determine what such a mobilization may have cost Australia and whether it could have afforded it. Before doing this we will take a quick digression into weapons and arms production. This is because the lead times to produce some weapons also affects mobilization times and cost. The availability and cost of weapons and technology affected what type of defense force could be fielded in 1941. Essentially the Army was well placed to obtain most of its weapons and equipment from local manufacture. Shortages that did occur during the war happened largely because orders for equipment were not placed early enough to support the expansion of the Army. Admittedly, in the 1930s, Australian factories only had tools and designs for World War I-era weapons. But this is less of a disadvantage than it seems. The World War I field guns and anti-aircraft guns were not greatly different in performance to the newer designs. The key equipment that needed to be sourced from overseas were vehicle engines. Any plan for mobilization would require establishing war stocks of engines from Britain or the United States well before 1939. Finally, all 3 services were affected by the availability of raw material for radio valve manufacture, especially tungsten wire and light gauge nickel, and molybdenum sheet. The Navy was also fairly well served by industry and local manufacture, especially for smaller vessels. At one point, Australian shipyards were able to deliver corvettes at a rate of 1 vessel every 1.2 months. The lead time for larger displacement ships such as destroyers and cruisers was over 2 years. In this sense, the Navy had to fight with what larger vessels it had at the war's start. It was not the case for smaller vessels, such as corvettes. One key weapon that the Navy had trouble obtaining was the torpedo. Plans to manufacture torpedoes took most of the war to be set in place. So, the Navy either needed to stockpile these in the mid-1930s, or start manufacturing plants in Australia at the same time. One advantage of earlier mobilization would be that industry to support all 3 services would develop and expand in the late 1930s rather than belatedly in the early 1940s. Finally, the Air Force was the service most dependent upon foreign equipment. Australia started development of aircraft manufacture from the mid-1930s. The Wirraway training and general-purpose aircraft was built under license to an American design. Unfortunately, manufacturing capability had not matured sufficiently to build contemporary combat aircraft until after 1942. For fighter aircraft and medium bombers, Australia needed to buy large quantities of the most contemporary aircraft it could. Due to Royal Air Force demands on British industry, the aircraft would be American. Practically speaking, this would have meant Australia would fight the start of the war with aircraft inferior to Japanese fighters. But it was the case for all the Allies until 1943. Heavy losses would occur until Australian pilots learned, as they did in the war, to use tactics to defeat the superior Japanese aircraft. Due to the speed with which aircraft technology was changing in the 1930s, the Air Force would need to keep its fleet as up-to-date as possible. This might mean replacing aircraft that were only several years old. The need for the Air Force to buy many aircraft and often might seem prohibitively expensive. But, as we shall see next, military aircraft and equipment in general were not the major drivers of mobilization costs. We mentioned that equipment, including aircraft, are not the major cost driver in mobilization for national defense. To illustrate this, consider an Air Force squadron during the war. Its aircraft would cost approximately £300,000 to buy. To pay the crew wages to run the squadron for a 3-year period would cost another £300,000. But what about the cost for the training aircraft to train the new pilots? Or, the costs to obtain and analyze intelligence needed by the squadron to plan its missions? Or, the cost to supply ammunition, fuel, replacement parts and food and water. Over a 3-year period, the full cost of running a single squadron was very approximately £6 million. To put this in perspective, in the year before war started with Germany, Australia spent a total of only £17 million on all 3 services. What about other military units and ships? No weapon system or platform had a purchase cost much above 20% of the total 3-year purchase and operating cost. Army units had the lowest equipment cost but, overall, were the most expensive to run. An infantry brigade had a full cost of almost £10 million per annum, making each division close to £30 million per annum. The chart shows the annual operating costs for various military organizations via the left axis. The right axis shows the cost of equipment as a percentage of total 3-year operating costs. Using these costs we can now determine the cost to mobilize a defense force of 8 army divisions, 60 aircraft squadrons and some 100 combat naval vessels, applying the model for mobilization we discussed earlier, then applying the full costs for the army units, air force squadrons and ships. We get a cumulative total for defense expenditure between the start of 1935 and end of 1942 of approximately £1,700 million. The actual historical expenditure over this same period is £1,400 million. An additional £300 million does not seem like a high premium to pay to actually have been prepared for war with Japan. Was this additional expenditure really beyond Australian capabilities? This graph shows Australia's historical pre-war expenditure, in red lines. Orange lines represent the expenditure needed to achieve the mobilization plan to defend against Japan in the scenario we have been discussing. Finally, the yellow lines represent what expenditure would have been had Australia expended at a rate proportional to Britain. Had Australia simply expended at a rate proportionate to the British taxpayer, Australia would have had a very good foundation for its defence. This would have funded 80% of the proposed mobilization we decided was needed to defend against Japan. However, establishing a good base pays dividends once war begins, as we will see in the next graph. Having established a critical mass from which effective mobilization could happen, Australia starts to benefit from the start of the war with Germany. The actual cost of completing the mobilization and deployment is less than both Australia's historical defence expenditure in this period, and, well, less than if Australia expended at a rate proportionate to Britain. So where does all this leave us? Armed with full hindsight, we have looked at one defence scenario for Australia. The Japanese threat that existed in 1941 to 1942. From our analysis it seems Australia was far from undefendable. Archibald Fisk and Philip McBride were wrong. Australia had the capabilities and resources to have defended itself in the scenario we looked at. In fact, by 1944, Australia had the scale of defence force that it needed in 1941. So bad timing and poor planning were the cause of Australia's lack of defences. But were they the only reason for the precarious situation in 1941 to 1942? Poor planning does not completely explain Australia's lack of preparedness for an attack from Japan. In 1941, Australia had the equivalent of 5 trained and reasonably equipped army divisions. It had the equivalent of 17 aircraft squadrons flying contemporary aircraft, albeit with varying crew quality. It also had 33 warships of corvette size or bigger. A little less than half the effective air units were in the United Kingdom as part of the Empire Air Training Scheme. More than half the trained and reasonably equipped army units were in North Africa and the Mediterranean, along with about a quarter of the Navy's ships, and 3 aircraft squadrons. A division, 4 aircraft squadrons and another quarter of the Navy's ships were allocated to Malaya and the islands to Australia's north. Finally, as we assessed, in Australia were many army divisions and air squadrons on paper. However, effectively trained and equipped organizations consisted of a little over an army division and 4 squadrons of contemporary combat aircraft. Once again, armed with the knowledge of what actually happened in December 1941, this arrangement was obviously wrong. It left Australia too exposed. But how did well-intentioned and experienced Australian politicians and military leaders get it so wrong? How do we solve this puzzle? That is the subject of the third and final video in this series.